The girl was 17 years old, standing in a field outside a small Ontario town, and she had just decided that God was a lie. It was not a dramatic decision. There was no thunder, no argument, no moment of crisis. Just a quiet afternoon in the summer of 1921, the smell of cut hay in the air, and a thought that settled over her like a cloud covering the sun. None of it is real. She walked back to the farmhouse, sat down at the kitchen table, and never went back to church. Her name was Vivian Grace Macaulay, and the story of what happened next, what she became, what she walked away from, and what finally broke her open 40 years later, is one of the most extraordinary stories in Canadian Christian history that almost nobody knows. Vivian was born in 1904 in Napanee, Ontario, the second daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who kept an immaculate house and an even more immaculate Sunday attendance record. The family was Presbyterian in the way that most of their neighbors were Presbyterian. Faithfully, quietly, without asking too many questions. Her father read from Proverbs at breakfast. Her mother ran the women's auxiliary. Faith was the water they swam in, and like fish, they never thought much about it. But Vivian thought about everything. She was the kind of child who asked why in a household that found why vaguely impolite. Why did God allow suffering? Why were the missionaries in Africa right, and the people they were converting wrong? Why did the women in their church do all the work and none of the deciding? Her Sunday school teacher called her spirited. Her mother called her difficult. Her father, to his credit, called her sharp, and quietly slipped her books he thought she might find interesting. She devoured them. By the time she was 15, she had read more theology than most of the deacons in her church, and found it mostly unsatisfying. The arguments for God's existence felt circular. The comfort the faith was supposed to offer felt to her like a kind of arranged marriage. You accepted it because you were told to, and you were supposed to feel grateful. Then, in the summer of 1921, her younger sister fell ill with rheumatic fever. The church prayed. The women's auxiliary organized a vigil. Her father read psalms at the bedside every evening. Her sister recovered, but slowly, painfully, with a damaged heart that would trouble her the rest of her life. And Vivian stood in that field and thought, if God is real and powerful and loving, what exactly was the point of all that? She did not slam any doors. She did not announce her departure. She simply stopped believing, the way a fire stops burning when there is nothing left to feed it. What followed were years that her later friends would describe, gently, as the wilderness, though Vivian herself would have called them, just as gently, the good years. She left Napanee at 19 and made her way to Toronto, where she found work as a typist at a small legal firm. She was efficient, quick, and entirely unbothered by the long hours that wore other women down. She took night classes. She taught herself bookkeeping. By 25, she was managing the firm's accounts and had enough saved to rent a small apartment on Bloor Street that she furnished herself, piece by piece, with items from estate sales. She loved that apartment. She loved the city. She loved the particular freedom of being a woman who owed no explanations to anyone, no husband, no congregation, no God. In the 1920s and 30s in Toronto, that kind of freedom was not exactly common, and Vivian wore it with a quiet satisfaction that people sometimes mistook for coldness. She was not cold. She was careful. There is a difference. She married once in 1931 to a decent man named Jeffrey who worked for the railway and liked order and stability, and as it turned out, a wife who would not challenge him. The marriage lasted 4 years. It ended without cruelty and without any particular grief. They were simply two people who had wanted different things and been too polite to say so until it was impossible to pretend otherwise. Vivian kept the apartment. Jeffrey kept the dog. They parted on a Tuesday afternoon, and she was back at her desk by Wednesday morning. Her colleagues thought she was remarkable. Her sister, who had recovered enough to marry and have children, and who had kept her faith through it all, thought she was lonely. Vivian herself did not give the question much thought. She was busy. There was always something to be busy with. By 1945, she had her own accounting firm, small only 4 employees, but entirely hers. She had built it through the Depression by taking clients nobody else wanted. Small businesses on the edge of collapse, farmers who had never kept proper records, widows sorting through estates that were more debt than asset. She had a reputation for being honest about bad news and practical about what to do with it. In a decade when dishonesty had ruined half the country, that was worth something. She did not think about faith during these years. It simply did not come up. Toronto in the 1940s was full of churches. Their spires were part of the skyline. Their bells were part of the Sunday morning soundscape. But Vivian moved through the city the way you move through a neighborhood where the shops sell things you have no use for. Peacefully, without resentment, simply not stopping. She was 41 when the war ended. She was 43 when she hired a young woman named Patricia to help with correspondence. And Patricia, who was warm and chatty and incapable of keeping anything to herself, began leaving small devotional booklets on the corner of Vivian's desk. Vivian moved them to the bookshelf without reading them. Patricia left more. Vivian moved those too. It became, in a quiet way, a kind of conversation without words. The moment that changed everything did not come from Patricia, or from a church, or from any of the things that Vivian might have expected to shake her. It came from a hospital room in the winter of 1956, when she was 52 years old and a diagnosis she had been quietly dreading for months was finally confirmed: cancer. Operable, the surgeon said, likely survivable. But the words sat in the air between them like something that had fallen off a shelf and could not be put back. She drove herself home. She made tea. She sat in her apartment, the same apartment she had furnished piece by piece 30 years ago, now comfortable with age and full of books, and she tried to think clearly about what she felt. What she felt, to her considerable surprise, was not fear. It was something closer to grief. Not grief about dying exactly. Grief about the particular shape her life had taken. Grief about the efficiency of it, the neatness, the way she had arranged everything so well and kept herself so carefully unbothered. She had built a very good life. She had built it alone, which had felt like freedom, and now, sitting in it, it felt like something else. She picked up one of Patricia's booklets, not because she believed anything in it, just because it was there. She does not remember, later, exactly what she read. What she remembers is this. She read until she reached a line. She never recalled which book it was from or who wrote it, and something in her stopped, not dramatically, not with any particular emotion, just stopped. You have not been abandoned. You have been waited for. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went back to her tea, which had gone cold, and she did not think about it consciously for another 3 weeks. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a window that has been opened in a room that has been sealed too long. There was air where there had not been air before. The surgery went well. The recovery was slow. 6 weeks, which Vivian spent at her sister's house in Napanee, which was the first time she had stayed there for more than a weekend in 30 years. Her sister, whose name was Helen, had 5 children and a husband and a warmth that Vivian had always found slightly exhausting. That winter, she did not find it exhausting. She found it like sunlight. She asked Helen questions she had not asked since she was a child, about faith, about what it felt like, about whether it was something you reasoned yourself into, or something that happened to you. Helen, who had never once tried to convert her older sister and had prayed for her every single day for decades without saying so, answered carefully and without pressure. The way you answer someone who is asking for the first time and might stop asking if you push too hard. Vivian went to church on Christmas morning, sitting beside Helen, and did not feel what she expected to feel, which was nothing. She felt, instead, oddly at home, not because of the service or the music or the words, particularly, just because she was sitting beside her sister, who had loved her through 40 years of silence, and that love suddenly felt like evidence of something she could not quite name. She did not give her life to Christ on Christmas morning in a country church in Napanee, Ontario. That is not how it happened, and she was always clear about that when she told the story later. What happened was slower and stranger than that. It happened over the next several months, in small increments, the way water finds its way through stone, not crashing through but wearing through, steadily until one day the stone is different from what it was. By the spring of 1957, she was praying. She did not tell anyone at first. She felt slightly ridiculous. She had spent 35 years being very certain that none of this was real, and now here she was, talking to the air, in her apartment on Bloor Street before she went to sleep. The remarkable thing, the thing she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain, was that the air talked back. Not in words, not in visions, in the quiet certainty, morning after morning, that she was not alone, that the grief she had felt in that hospital room had been heard, that the long sealed room of her adult life had not been sealed by God but by herself, and the window had always been there, waiting for her to open it. She was 53 years old. She was starting over, and she had absolutely no idea what that meant. What it meant, as it turned out, was extraordinary. She started going to a small Anglican church near her apartment. Chosen, she admitted later, partly because Anglicans were unlikely to bother her with enthusiasm before she was ready for enthusiasm. She sat in the back. She listened. She asked her questions, and this time she found, to her genuine surprise, that some of the answers satisfied her in ways they had not when she was 17. She began studying scripture the way she had once studied tax law, systematically, without sentimentality, following the argument wherever it led. She read church history. She read the mystics. She read contemporary theologians who wrestled with the same doubts she had wrestled with, and for the first time in her life she did not feel like the only person who had found faith difficult. She got involved, carefully at first, helping with the church's bookkeeping, because that was what she knew. Then more. She started attending a small group that met on Thursday evenings to pray and read scripture together. She brought her accountant's precision to everything. Careful with what she claimed, honest about what she did not know, allergic to easy answers. People noticed. Not because she was dramatic or charismatic or particularly warm in the way that sometimes draws people toward church leaders, but because she was real. She asked the questions that people were afraid to ask out loud. She said, "I don't know," without apology. She had spent 35 years without faith, and she did not pretend that faith was easy or automatic or available to everyone on the same terms. She was 61 when the rector asked her to speak at a women's gathering. Not a sermon, he was careful to say, just her story. She agreed reluctantly. She stood up in front of 40 women and said, "I spent most of my adult life being absolutely certain that God was not real. I was wrong, and I would like to tell you what changed my mind." The room was completely quiet. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not use notes. She told the truth. About the field in 1921. About the good years that were also the lonely years. About the hospital room. About the booklet on her desk that she had moved to the shelf a dozen times before she finally read it. She told it the way she told everything. Clearly, without decoration, and with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime being careful about what she claimed. When she finished, a woman in the third row was crying, then another, then several more, not because Vivian had done anything dramatic, because she had described an experience that many of them had had and never been given language for. The long distance from God, the doubt that felt like integrity, and the strange, slow, utterly unexpected way back. 3 women asked to speak with her privately afterward. 2 of them had not been to church in decades. 1 of them had never been at all. Vivian was not prepared for this. She had given her story thinking it would be a one-time thing. She had not considered that her story might be exactly what other people needed to hear. The next decade was the decade she would later call the real work. She did not close her accounting firm. She was practical enough to know that a ministry without income is a ministry with a very short lifespan. But she began carving out more and more time for something that had no official name yet. She visited women in hospital. She corresponded with people who had written to the church, asking questions that the clergy did not always know how to answer. The angry questions, the grieving questions, the "I used to believe, and now I don't" questions that are among the hardest to sit with. She was good at those questions. She had sat with them herself for 35 years. By the time she was 65, she had developed what she called, with characteristic practicality, a course for doubters, a series of 8 evenings that moved through the major objections to Christian faith, not to demolish them, but to take them seriously. She had written it herself, sitting at the same desk where she had once done tax returns, applying the same rigor to theology that she had once applied to balance sheets. The course was not slick. There were no promotional materials, no branding, no strategy. It spread entirely by word of mouth, the way the most useful things do. One person telling another, "You should talk to this woman," or "There's this thing on Thursday nights that might help you." Churches began inviting her to run it for their congregations. She went because she had learned by now to go when she was asked. She ran it in Anglican churches and United churches and Presbyterian churches, and once in a Salvation Army hall in Thunder Bay, which she had never visited before and found, to her delight, exactly as sensible and no-nonsense as she was herself. She was not a speaker in the conventional sense. She was not polished. She had a dry wit that sometimes alarmed people who were expecting uplift and got honesty instead. But she had something that proved, over time, to be worth more than polish. She had credibility. She had lived the doubt herself. She had not come to faith because she was raised in it, or because she was frightened, or because it was socially convenient. She had come to it at 53, reluctantly, after testing it as rigorously as she knew how. And she had found it true. That mattered to people in ways she had not anticipated. She was 70 when she went to Vancouver for the first time, invited by a church that had heard about her course and wanted her to run it for a group of university students who were asking questions the church did not know how to answer. University students were not her usual audience. She arrived expecting to be politely received and found them instead hungry, not for easy comfort but for honest engagement. They pushed back. They challenged. One young man spent 40 minutes in the third session arguing that the existence of suffering made a loving God impossible, and Vivian listened to him all the way to the end, nodded seriously, and said, "I thought exactly the same thing when I was 17. Here is why I no longer do, and here is what still troubles me." He came back the next week, and the week after that. She ran the course in Vancouver for 3 months. By the end, she was running it in 4 different churches simultaneously. With volunteers she had trained to facilitate the sessions she could not personally lead. There were over 200 people enrolled. She went home to Toronto and immediately started writing a proper manual. Not because she had planned to publish anything, but because she was a practical woman and she could see that the only way to scale what she was doing was to make it teachable without her. The manual was 60 pages long. It was called, with the same lack of drama that characterized everything she did, starting from doubt, A Guide for Honest Seekers. She published it herself in 1975, printed at a small press in Toronto, and sent copies to every minister who had ever invited her to speak. Within a year, she was getting letters from across Canada. Within 3 years, she was getting them from the United States, from Britain, from Australia. Churches were using her course without her. Strangers were writing to say it had changed their lives. A woman in Nova Scotia wrote to say that she had given copies to every person in her small coastal village who had drifted from faith, and 7 of them had returned to church. Vivian wrote back to all of them. Every single letter. She was 73, 74, 75. She was doing the work of 3 people, and she felt, she said once to Helen, more alive than she had felt at any point in her efficient, practical, carefully managed life. She was 78 when her health began to decline. The cancer that had been beaten in 1956 did not return, but age did what age does, and she found herself moving more slowly, tiring more easily, needing rest in a way that had never been required of her before. She did not stop. She slowed. There is a difference, and she was the first to point it out. She stopped traveling. She ran the course from her apartment for small groups who came to her. She continued the correspondence, now substantial enough that Patricia, who had been with her for 30 years, came in 3 mornings a week just to help manage it. She continued writing, producing 2 more small books in her late 70s and early 80s that were less formal than the first. More like letters, she said, to the people who had written to her asking questions she had not addressed yet. She was thinking by this point about legacy. Not sentimentally, practically. She had always been practical. She began meeting regularly with a small group of people she had trained over the years. Ministers, lay leaders, counselors, who understood what she had built well enough to carry it forward. She spent months making sure the course materials were thorough. The training was documented. The thing could live without her. She had spent 40 years understanding that the work was never about her. She was very clear about that in those final meetings. "I am not the point of this," she told them, in the dry voice she had never quite lost. in the apartment on Bloor Street that she had now lived in for over 50 years. The doubter across the table from you. That person is the point. Do not ever forget that. Vivian Grace Macaulay died in Toronto in 1988 at the age of 84. She had lived in the same apartment for 54 years. She had never remarried. She had no children of her own. She had started her faith journey at 52, later than almost anyone would have thought possible. By the time she died, her course had been completed by more than 40,000 people across 5 countries. The manual had been translated into French, German, and Korean. Churches she had never visited, in cities she had never been to, were using the framework she had built at her desk on Bloor Street from her own doubt and her own questions and her own long, stubborn 35-year argument with a God she had decided did not exist. She never knew the final numbers. She did not need to. She had learned somewhere in her 50s that you do not get to see the full scope of what you plant. You just plant it, you tend it, you trust. There is a photograph of her taken late in her life, in her late 70s, at a small gathering in someone's living room, in the middle of what looks like a discussion. She is leaning forward slightly. She is listening. You can see in her face the expression that people who knew her described again and again. Absolute attention. Total seriousness. The look of a woman who believes, without reservation, that the person speaking is worth listening to. She looks nothing like a saint. She looks like someone's sharp, precise, slightly terrifying aunt who could spot an error in your books at 50 paces, and would not spare your feelings when she told you about it, that is, by all accounts, exactly what she was. And that is exactly why it worked. If you have ever sat with doubt the way Vivian sat with it, long, patient, stubborn doubt that felt, somehow, more honest than easy belief, then her story is in some ways your story too. Not because her path is a template, it is not. She would be the first to tell you that. But because she proved, in the most practical and unglamorous way possible, that starting late is not the same as starting wrong, that the long way around is still a way, that God, whatever else he is apparently quite patient. She was 17 when she walked out of faith. She was 53 when she walked back in, and she was 84 when she ran out of time. Which, given what she managed to do with the 31 years in between, suggests that the question is never really whether you have enough time left. The question is what you decide to do with it.